going to show you briefly on this map where Ur of the Chaldeans was. You can see that's down here, Saudi Arabia. This is Iran. And this is Iraq. This is a kind of a modern map from today, so you can see Ur is in southern Iraq, and then Abram's family moves up to Haran, which is in northern Iraq near the border with Turkey, and then they come back down to go to the Promised Land. This is, the Fertile Crescent, this area, and just so you know where we're talking about geographically, I thought I'd show you that. I'm also going to post some pictures of that and send them out in email in my class and maybe put them where you can get them. Hello and welcome back. We're going to be in part 2 of our study on the book of Genesis, life of Abraham. And if you've got a Bible, we're going to start at the end of chapter 11 and go through verse 27 to the end, just to kind of set the stage for what's going on. As I told you last time, the years before chapter 12 and then the years since chapter 12 till us, if you had to guess which one is the greater amount of years, it would be the years before chapter 12. So Genesis 1 through 11 covers a period of years much longer than what we're about to go over right now involving Abraham. So people have tried to put a date to when Abraham lived. They've said anywhere from 2000 BC to about 1750 BC. You have to look at really how the book of Genesis and Exodus count all the events that happened between Abraham and the Exodus. There's a way of counting it where you count the Exodus as 400 separate years and it adds time to the timeline, or you look at a way where it's 400 years until Abraham, from Abraham till the Exodus, which takes years from the timeline. There's some ways between that, so we don't know exactly when Abraham lived. But here's an interesting thing about it. All the place names in the book of Genesis, all of the people groups that are mentioned, even the phonetic variants of the names. To give you an example, we know what the word Terah means. That's Abraham's father. It's of an ibex. We know what Haran means. That's Lot's father, Abraham's brother. It means mountaineer. We know what Abram means, which is Abram's name before God calls him Abraham. It's exalted or high father. These are real names from that time period, from that language group. So we really trust the history, the accuracy, and just general evidence for this book being an actual historical construction. It would be a little suspicious if the book of Genesis started off with a man named Gus and tried to say that he lived in modern-day Iraq. We would say, I don't think Gus is really an Iraqi name, and maybe the author is not very good at historical fiction. So we look at details like that and just say, whenever this was, between 2000 or 1600 BC, there's a window there. We know that it's accurate with the description of the world at that time in that area and with the languages and people and place names of that area. So let's get into verse 27 of chapter 11 and we'll read together. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Now Ur is in South Iraq. It was a Chaldean or old Babylonian type city. The world they lived in, it was not like a massive empire with administrations. It was city-states. Now you might have a dominant city, like you can imagine that if there was as big a city as Atlanta, it might dominate cities around it like Athens, Marietta, Georgia, little smaller cities like that just by the fact that it's massive and rich and has a lot of gravity. But we don't need to think of this as like a stable empire like the Roman Empire. These are city-states. They're always changing who's dominant and who's serving or a vassal to another city-state, and they're always fighting. And so he lives in Ur of the Chaldeans. He is a Middle Eastern, kind of, Babylonian. Sometimes they call them Aramaean after Aram. That's also where we get the term Aramaic from, but that's a later language. But he's not Jewish. We think he's the father of Jewish people. He must be Jewish. Well, he's just like everyone else in his city. Because he has the name Exalted or High Father, Abram, there's some speculation that his father might have been powerful. He might have been extremely wealthy. And as we know, Abram moves with a bunch of flocks later on in Genesis. His father might have been so powerful that some type of dynastic or political struggle started his movement away from Ur. He might have ended up on the bad side of a ruler's temperamental nature and had to take his family quickly out of Ur, and they moved to Haran. So they kind of move up the Fertile Crescent, closer to the top where the Tigris and Euphrates go into kind of like, central and northern Iraq. So Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans, and Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. That's important. Just remember that as we keep going through this lesson. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. One thing to think about, though, is that when most of Genesis is taking place, Terah is still in Haran, alive. Just because it says he died now, it's just removing him from the story. This is kind of how a lot of Hebrew narrative works. We don't want you to think about Terah anymore, Abram's father. He dies in Haran at 205 years old, which is kind of like, 40 or 50 years down the road, I think. I can't remember my math here. But you're looking at this and going, wow, they just leave him there. He's not a central figure to this story. He's just where Abram came from. So what we're about to see in chapter 12, verse 1, is the biggest transition so far in the Bible. The flood was smaller than this. I'd say, well, since the fall, but the flood was smaller than this. The Tower of Babel was smaller than this. All these other stories in Genesis up to this point have just gotten us to this point. This is a humongous verse in the Bible. And if you understand the way that Genesis is turning right here, it's going to be really good to understand the rest of the Bible. So verse 1 of chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, and some translations have that past tense. Now the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. So if it's in past tense, that means that Abram didn't go at once. He probably tried to take his father along, and Terah just said, hey, I like Haran, I'm staying here. If God had told him just now, maybe they were heading to Canaan and got distracted, then God said, no, I've got a new mission for you. You go to Canaan. Whether it's past tense or whether it's present tense, we really deal with the same thing. God commanded, and Abram at some point went. He left his father's house and went to Canaan. So go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you'll be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So he's 75, and his father had him when he's 70. So his father is 145, and he lives another 60 years past this point. But we don't hear about him anymore. So I want to make a couple of comments on the way that Hebrew history and narrative works. It was a mainly illiterate culture. They spoke, and you would memorize the story as you heard it told around a campfire at night, or around a tent, or as you were just out walking with the herds or planting wheat, or you would hear it. And that's how most people in ancient times remembered these things. So if you read the Hebrew of Genesis, it's very repetitive. It has a structure to it, and it really helps in memory. Well, one of the ways they did that was with repeated words or plays on words. So we're going to go through 12, 1 through 3 again, and every time you hear the word blessed or blessing, I want you to hold a finger up. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. So, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So we've got what looks like 5 instances of bless. So we're going to look back through Genesis now, and I want you to turn back to Genesis 1:22. In Genesis 1:22, and God saw it was good, verse 22, and God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply." So there's a blessing. Now Genesis 1:28, male and female, he created them, verse 28, and God blessed them. So that's 2 blessings. Genesis 2:3. So God blessed the 7th day. That's 3. Genesis 5:2. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them. All right. Well, that's 4. Now 9:1. Chapter 9, verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons. That's 5 blessings. So it's interesting that in 12, 1 through 3, you have the word blessed used 5 times. And in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you have the word bless used 5 times. Now, did the composer of this history plan it that way? One theory is that yes, they did. They were showing you with a code. Basically, you would have heard that, you'd have remembered it, you'd have memorized it, and when you come to chapter 12, you say, Abraham is blessed so much, he's as blessed as the entire creation has been from chapter 1 of Genesis, chapter 11, even though they didn't have chapters. But so far, Abram has blessings on him beyond what the rest of the book of Genesis has written about God blessing things. Let's say that they did not intend it this way, and that the Holy Spirit inspired it, just to show, look how blessed Abraham is. Either way, whether it's an intentional clustering of the word Barak, which is, by the way, where we get the name Barack, like Barack Obama. Barak means blessed. Whether it's intentional or whether it is just supernatural evidence for a divine revelator at work in the greater plan of Scripture, it means the same thing. Abram is really blessed. There's something going on here huge in his life, and God has focused and concentrated blessings on him. And so just looking through his blessedness, we sit back and we go, why would this man be so blessed that God would basically tell him, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed? I mean, we're dealing with something here that's pretty big. One man is going to end up blessing the entire world from this point on. So, very simply put, what we've hit here is the start of God's plan of redemption. Now, everything from chapter 1 to chapter 11 has been scattering. After God created it and the fall happened, God scattered all of the good things in creation. Everything has been cursed. Everything has been subject to decay and being broken up. Peoples have been broken up. Their tongues have been divided. The world's been split up. And so what you see between 11:32 and 12:1 is the change from scattering to gathering. So all the nations of the world were scattered through Adam, but they're going to be blessed through Abram. You have the change from cursing to blessing. Well, God cursed creation, and he cursed the woman, and he cursed the snake whenever the fall happened, and now he's blessing all families through Abram. You also have a general humanity where God just let them multiply and spread out, but now you're having what looks like the start of a new humanity, a new nation, a new people. Where he says in verse 2, I will make of you a great nation. So this is especially interesting if Abram and his father had any royal or even noble ties to the original city they were from. They've just gotten, left their city, whether it was fighting, whether it was just a threat, whether we don't know what it was. But if it was something where Abram had to leave, his family had to flee because of some type of dynastic, dynasties, infighting, it's interesting that God's like, no, I'm going to make you a great nation, but you're going to move over here way out of anywhere you've ever been and live, as a nomadic herder. We sit here and we think about the fact that God now, instead of scattering humanity, is beginning to gather them and build a nation. And it's interesting because in Genesis up to this point, you've had like crazy things happening, like angels trying to take wives for themselves from the daughters of men and making this race of super renowned giant warriors, or that's one interpretation of Genesis 6. And you've had a flood come and wipe out humanity, and you've had murderers who sing songs about how if anyone kills me, it's going to be even worse than if the mark of Cain was on me. Just making songs about murder. You've got these horrible things happening. You've got violence and sin and destruction everywhere. And in chapter 12, you have what's the start of the fix of all that. You have this, like I said in the last lesson, everything's going one way, then it's just going to turn immediately. And you're going to have a really big transition into God's blessing of humanity a second time. He blessed them at the beginning to be fruitful and multiply. And now he's going to bless them in a different way. So it's worth noting that Sarai plays a very important part in this story. Like I said, Genesis elevates women. It was a tough world. It was a man's world, but the Bible does not just leave women as some type of, spectator for God's redemption. It makes them participants in it and recipients of it. And so Sarai was barren, remember, in 11:30. She had no child. She really is a picture of the human race at this point. We have no life in us. We're old, past the point of being able to do this ourselves, and we're barren. There's no future. And what ends up happening through the story is that it ends in multiplication and blessing, what started in barrenness and being cursed. Being barren as a woman in the ancient world was seen as a divine curse, that God had closed your womb, that the favor of God was not on you, and that you could not carry on your husband's line. Well, God picks very interesting servants to accomplish his purposes, and he picks a barren old woman to be the mother of this new redemptive community. And so just really cool literary move here in the Bible, where the story of the Bible is just it's amazing. I mean, the way that God sets things up to kind of confound us and trick us and say, look what I can do with things that you wouldn't really count as very worthy. So just go over a few, just summing everything up. Abram is the start of the redemptive community in the story of Genesis. We know the word redemption and we know the word community in the church. We are the redemptive community on earth. Well, Abram is our father too, because the New Testament says he's the father of all who believe. He's not just the father of the ethnic nation of Israel. As the Bible just said, all nations will be blessed through him. And so God is starting over with his purpose to bless his creation. He said it was blessed 5 times in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But then he puts 5 blessings on Abraham in this little passage. And Abram was specially chosen to start a renewed community in God's creation. God could have picked any person he wanted. For some reason, he picked this guy right here. We don't know why. That's God's dealing, not ours. But it's not just that God was sending out want ads saying, I need some help starting a redemptive community, apply in Canaan. They did not do that, or God did not do that. He picked Abram. He told him, leave and go. And Abram did. God had this planned out from the beginning, and Abram was his chosen vessel to accomplish this. So God's promise to Abram is not a new promise. This was something where we say it might be a new way in which God is doing it, but it's the restatement of the original purpose of creation. Humans were supposed to be a blessing to the world and to ourselves. We were supposed to be good for each other. We were supposed to be good for the planet. We were supposed to be good and image God's glories everywhere we went. We were supposed to subdue the creation. We were supposed to have dominion over it, not break it, destroy it, but vitalize it, use it, tame it, harness it for good. And Abram is going to be part of that renewed process, both morally and agriculturally and everything. I mean, he's gonna start a nation that receives God's perfect law, receives God's redemptive acts, and eventually where the Messiah comes from. So, I want to talk about 2 last questions here, and then we'll finish up chapter 2. And that is, who was this God to Abram? And so this is an interesting question because whenever we think about the word God, actually God is German from Gott. The Germans will exclaim, Gott im Himmel, God in heaven. God is just a loan word, kind of like the word in Hebrew, El, E-L, Elohim. That was just basically a word for a god or gods. It was a word that went across several different Middle Eastern languages, and they just adopted it for God. Now, later God shows his name, but the word El, or the word God, is just a generic word that we use for deity. God, as he expresses himself in Genesis, does not give a lot of information. All we know is that Abraham knew he had been talked to by a superior being who owned him, who could command him, who deserved his worship and his admiration, and he obeys him. We don't know what Abram thought at first, but we know that as God continues to teach himself to Abraham, or to Abram now, Abram responds in faith as he learns more about God. The second part is, think about Abram's response to what God told him. Well, he was obedient. Whether he was obedient from the beginning, like we said, if it's just, and the Lord said to Abraham, leave, and he did, or if it is the Lord had said way in the past, and leave, and then they went to Haran, and then Abram was like, well, I better go. either way he obeyed, whether he obeyed all at once or whether he obeyed kind of in stages, which we're going to see Abram obeys a lot in stages later in this chapter, or in this book, I mean. Abram's response was one of obedience and faith. He listened to God, even though he didn't know a lot about him, and he obeys him. And so one of the big messages we're going to get out of this book is just how to obey God when you don't exactly know what's going on, which is a pretty good lesson to learn right now when we're all, in a pandemic. None of us know what's going to happen in the next 3 to 4 months. But we know God, we know his character, and we trust him. So as you look over Genesis 12, the beginning of it, think about what Abram might have been feeling as he's leaving his home. He's moving, he's going, and God is telling him, I'm going to bless you. You're going to be a blessing. So that's all for part 2. I will see you soon for part 3. Thank you.